For centuries, one empire stood at the center of wealth, power, and control, the Roman Empire. Its legions marched across continents. Its roads stitched together distant lands. Its markets connected worlds from the cold edges of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. But behind all this unimaginable power, there was something surprisingly simple. A coin, a small silver coin that quietly held together one of the greatest economic systems the ancient world had ever seen. This coin paid soldiers. It fueled trade. It moved wealth across thousands of miles. And for generations, people trusted it. Soldiers trusted it. Merchants trusted it. Tax collectors trusted it. This coin, the Roman denarius, became one of the most reliable currencies in history. Until it wasn't. Because at the very height of Roman power, something changed. Roman emperors discovered a dangerous truth about money. If you control the mint, you control the currency. And if you control the currency, you can change its value without anyone noticing at first. The coin still looked the same. It still carried the emperor's face. It still claimed the same worth. But inside, something had quietly changed. Less silver, less weight, less real value. At first, the difference was almost invisible. But over time, those tiny changes began to spread. Like cracks in a foundation. Prices started rising. Wages struggled to keep up. Merchants became cautious, then suspicious. And slowly, people began to realize something deeply unsettling. The money they trusted was no longer what it used to be. Welcome to a story where money, power, and history collide. Where empires don't just fall from war. They weaken from within. This is the story of how Rome walked into one of the earliest inflation crises in history. To understand how it all began, we need to go back to a moment of crisis. Around 211 BC, during the brutal Second Punic War, Rome was fighting for survival. The war against Carthage had pushed the republic to its limits. Armies needed to be funded, soldiers needed to be paid, and the state needed a reliable system to keep everything running. So Rome created something revolutionary, the denarius, a silver coin carefully designed for trust. Each coin contained about 4.5 grams of silver. It was strong, portable, consistent, and most importantly, it was reliable. In the ancient world, money wasn't just a symbol. It had real value. People didn't trust governments the way we do today. They trusted metal. When someone accepted a Roman coin, they weren't trusting Rome. They were trusting the silver inside it. And for nearly 2 centuries, that trust held strong. The denarius spread across the empire, connecting distant economies into one powerful system. Farmers sold grain for it. Merchants used it to trade across seas and roads. Soldiers counted their wages in neat stacks of silver. It became a universal language of value. From Spain to Syria, from Gaul to North Africa, this stability allowed Rome to build something extraordinary, a truly integrated economy. Trade flourished. Taxes flowed. Markets expanded. In many ways, this small silver coin became the silent backbone of Roman power. But empires are expensive. As Rome grew, so did its problems. Borders stretched thousands of miles. Armies had to defend every inch. Fortresses needed to be built. Roads, ports, and aqueducts required constant maintenance. And above everything else, soldiers had to be paid. By the time Rome reached its imperial peak, its military was no longer temporary. It was permanent, massive. Each legion had around 5,000 soldiers, and there were dozens of legions across the empire. Add to that auxiliary forces, and the cost became enormous. For a while, Rome managed. Taxes from rich provinces filled the treasury. War victories brought treasure. The system held together. But slowly, pressure began to build. Quietly, almost invisibly. Then came a turning point. During the reign of Emperor Nero, from 54 to 68 CE, Rome's spending began to spiral. Massive building projects, military campaigns, and the extravagant lifestyle of the imperial court. The treasury was under strain. And Nero made a decision, a small one, at least on the surface. He reduced the silver content of the denarius. The coin still looked the same, still official, still carried authority. But now, it contained slightly less silver. From the government's perspective, it was a clever solution. Less silver per coin meant more coins could be produced. More coins meant more money to pay soldiers, fund projects, and cover expenses without raising taxes. It was, in essence, an early form of printing money. And at first it worked. Nothing collapsed overnight. Markets continued. People kept trading. Soldiers accepted their pay. The system kept moving. But something had changed forever. A line had been crossed. Because once a government realizes it can manipulate its currency, the temptation never truly disappears. And it didn't. Over the next century, Roman emperors returned to the same trick. Again, and again, and again, each time reducing the silver just a little more. Under Emperor Trajan, Rome reached its greatest territorial expansion. Victories brought wealth, but they also brought new responsibilities. More land, more borders, more soldiers, more cost. Success itself became a financial burden, and to sustain it, more coins were needed. So the silver content kept shrinking, slowly, steadily, almost invisibly, until by the early 3rd century, the coin that once represented strength, trust, and stability had lost a significant part of its true value, and the consequences were just beginning. But the real breaking point didn't come quietly. It came during one of the darkest and most unstable chapters in Roman history. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, something shifted. The stability that had defined Rome for generations began to crack, slowly at first, then all at once. Historians today call it the crisis of the 3rd century, an age where power meant survival, and survival was never guaranteed. Emperors no longer ruled for decades. They barely survived years, sometimes only months. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 different men would claim the title of emperor. Most of them didn't die peacefully. They were overthrown, assassinated, or killed in battle. Rome wasn't just fighting enemies outside its borders anymore. It was tearing itself apart from within. Civil wars erupted between rival generals. Entire regions broke away. Border provinces collapsed under constant invasions. Germanic tribes pushed from the north. Persian armies advanced from the east. And at the center of it all, the Roman government was losing control. But in this chaos, one force remained constant: the Roman army. It wasn't just defending the empire anymore. It was deciding who ruled it. Because in this new Rome, whoever controlled the loyalty of the legions controlled the throne. And that changed everything. Because if you want to become emperor, you didn't need tradition. You didn't need legitimacy. You needed soldiers, thousands of them, loyal, armed, and ready to fight for you. And the fastest way to earn that loyalty was simple: pay them more. This is the moment when Rome's monetary system truly began to collapse. In 215 CE, Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin, the annianus. On paper, it was worth 2 denarii, but in reality, it contained only about 1.5 times the silver. The illusion was clear. The government could create more money while pretending nothing had changed. At first, both coins circulated together, the old denarius and the new annianus. But slowly, the balance shifted. As emperors came and went, each one desperate to secure the army's loyalty. More coins flooded the system. More promises, more payments, more silver, stretched thinner and thinner. And then the quality began to collapse. Coins that once shined with silver started looking dull, uneven, cheap. By the middle of the 3rd century, many anniani contained so little silver you could barely see it. Some weren't even truly silver anymore. They were bronze coins, covered in a thin layer of silver wash, a disguise, a lie, stamped with imperial authority. And people noticed. Merchants noticed. Soldiers noticed. The market noticed. And when people start questioning money, everything begins to change. Because money only works if people trust it. At first, the changes were subtle, almost invisible. A merchant in Antioch charged a little more for grain, A blacksmith in Gaul slightly increased the price of his tools. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just small adjustments. But these small changes were signals. Something was wrong. Traders handling large amounts of coins stopped trusting the emperor's stamp. Instead, they began weighing coins, testing them, judging their true value, not their official one. This is how inflation really begins. Not with panic, but with doubt. People don't always understand what's happening, but they feel it. Prices creep upward. Transactions slow down. Trust begins to fade. And once that process starts, it rarely stops. In the Roman Empire, the 3rd century, the conditions were perfect for disaster. Political chaos, constant war, endless demand for money. Every new emperor faced the same problem. Secure the army or lose everything. And to secure the army, they had to pay, not just salaries, but bonuses, huge ones. When a general seized power, he often rewarded his soldiers with massive payments. These were called donatives, but in reality, they were political bribes, paid in coins that were losing value by the day. And as instability grew, so did the payments. And as payments grew, so did the need for more money. There was only one solution left: make more coins. Imperial mints across the empire worked relentlessly, producing currency at an unprecedented scale. But silver was limited, and every new batch of coins contained less of it. By the mid-3rd century, the Annianus had become a shadow of itself. Many coins contained less than 5% silver. The thin silver coating wore off quickly, revealing the bronze beneath. Rome had created something dangerous, a currency that looked valuable, but wasn't, and the markets reacted fast. Prices began rising faster. Farmers demanded more coins for grain. Traders raised prices on imported goods. Basic necessities became harder to afford. Even soldiers, the very backbone of imperial power, began to complain. Their wages no longer bought what they once did. So, what did the government do? It raised wages, but that only made things worse. More money entered circulation. Prices rose even higher. Workers demanded more pay, and the cycle accelerated faster and faster. This is the classic inflation spiral, a loop that feeds itself. And once it gains momentum, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. The Roman government was trapped. It needed the army. The army needed payment. Payment required money, and money had lost its value. Merchants adapted. They stopped trusting silver coins. Instead, they preferred gold. Gold held its value better. It became the real currency of trust. In some regions, people abandoned coins entirely. They returned to barter, exchanging goods directly, grain for tools, metal for livestock, a system older than Rome itself. Even taxes began to fail. The empire depended on taxes to survive. But when money constantly changes in value, taxes become unpredictable, unstable, useless. Coins collected in taxes arrived at the treasury already weakened, their purchasing power reduced. And once again, the government responded the only way it knew how. It printed more money. At this point, the damage was no longer just economic. It was systemic, because when money loses trust, it doesn't just affect markets. It affects power, control, authority. Provincial governors began acting independently. Military commanders followed their own interests. Local elites stopped relying on the central government. Rome was no longer one unified system. It was fragmenting. Between 235 and 284 C, the empire descended into chaos. More than 20 emperors rose and fell. Some ruled for only months, each one facing the same impossible problem. An empire too large to control, an army too expensive to maintain, and a currency that no longer meant what it claimed. And the worst part? The crisis was far from over. But now the question had changed. It was no longer just about money. It was about power, about control, about survival. How do you maintain loyalty in a system where the currency itself has lost credibility? Rome found itself trapped in a vicious cycle. The weaker the currency became, the harder it was to pay the army. And the harder it became to pay the army, the more emperors depended on the very thing causing problem. Debased money. Money had become both the disease and the symptom. Eventually, the crisis grew too large to ignore. Rome needed drastic action, and that action came in the form of a new emperor, a man determined to restore order no matter the cost. In 284 C, Diocletian rose to power, and what he inherited was an empire on the edge. Decades of chaos had shattered stability. The economy was broken, the currency was unreliable, and trust was nearly gone. Diocletian didn't hesitate. He launched one of the most ambitious recovery efforts in Roman history. He reorganized the empire, strengthened the military, expanded the administrative system, and most importantly, he tried to fix the economy. But there was one problem, a fundamental one. Inflation was already deeply rooted. Prices were rising everywhere, and controlling that rise would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. In 301 C, Diocletian made a bold move. He introduced a policy unlike anything Rome had attempted before, the Edict on Maximum Prices. It was massive, detailed, and incredibly strict. The government set fixed price limits on hundreds of goods and services: wheat, wine, meat, clothing, transport, even wages. The idea was simple. If the state could control prices, it could stop inflation. But reality doesn't follow orders, because the real problem wasn't prices. It was the currency itself. When money is losing value, forcing prices to stay low doesn't fix the issue. It breaks the system further. And that's exactly what happened. Merchants refused to sell goods at artificially low prices. Instead, they hid their products. Trade didn't stop. It went underground. Black markets began to rise. Places where goods were sold at their real value, away from the eyes of the state. The empire tried to enforce the law. Harshly, the penalties were extreme. Even death, for those who violated the price limits. But even fear couldn't defeat economic reality. The policy failed. Inflation continued. Markets resisted. And eventually, Rome abandoned the controls. The crisis had proven something undeniable. You cannot force trust into money. It has to exist. But Rome wasn't done yet, because another emperor would soon try a different approach, not by controlling prices, but by restoring trust itself. In the early 4th century, Constantine rose to power, and instead of fixing broken silver coins, he introduced something new, a gold coin, the solidus. It was different, consistent in weight, reliable in purity, stable in value, and people noticed. Unlike the silver coins that had been debased again and again, the solidus held its worth. Merchants trusted it, officials accepted it, and slowly, parts of the Roman economy began to stabilize. For centuries, this gold coin would remain one of the most trusted currencies in the world. But the damage had already been done. The silver system never recovered. The denarius, once the backbone of Roman commerce, quietly disappeared, and with it, an entire era of monetary stability came to an end. But this story isn't just about ancient Rome, because Rome didn't fall in a single moment. It didn't collapse overnight from invasion or defeat. Long before that, it weakened from within. It weakened when trust in its money began to fade, because once that trust disappears, everything else begins to follow. Markets lose confidence. Prices become unstable. Governments struggle to function, and people start looking for alternatives. The story of Roman inflation may sound ancient, distant, irrelevant. Silver coins, imperial mints, long-forgotten emperors. But the truth is, the pattern hasn't changed. Today, money isn't made of silver. It's digital, created by central banks, with a few keystrokes. But the incentives? They're still the same. When governments face rising debt, economic pressure, or political crisis, expanding the money supply can feel like the easiest solution. And sometimes it works. But if it goes too far, it risks destroying the very thing money depends on: trust. Rome learned that lesson the hard way, because once people begin questioning the value of money, restoring confidence becomes one of the hardest things any system can do. Rome didn't collapse because one coin lost its silver. It began to collapse when its leaders tried to solve political problems by manipulating the very foundation of its economy. And once that process started, even imperial power couldn't stop it. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. And one pattern appears again and again. The moment money loses trust is the moment the real crisis begins. If this changed the way you see history, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, because the answers are already in the past. You just need to know where to look. Fire.